Good evening, everyone, and you're very welcome indeed, and especially on such a rainy and miserable evening. Sure, what else would you be doing? But I know it's hard to get here with the traffic and all. Provost, Vice Provost, colleagues and visitors, good evening. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Cathal Walsh, as he takes the stage to deliver his inaugural lecture in the first established chair in biostatistics in Ireland. And I'd especially like to welcome Cahill's parents, Aileen and Bernard, who are here, his partner Roisin, and his children, Dominic, Elsa, Zoe, Ivan and Harry. We're delighted that you could join us for this special occasion. It won't happen again anytime soon, so make the best of it. Now, Professor Walsh's remarkable academic achievements are well known, and many of them are listed in the biography notes, so I won't go through them all. He's a self-declared proud Bayesian statistician and modeler, and maybe even evangelical about it, who has worked across the spectrum of bioscience. His research has ranged from structured clinical trials to bench science and longitudinal and community studies. Whether it's his deep interest in public health, his collaborative spirit in working across universities and countries, or his involvement in key health policy decisions during the COVID-19 pandemic, Cathal brings an energy that bridges the gap between data and real-world application. His work with the Irish Epidemiological Modelling Advisory Group during COVID-19 pandemic is just one example of how his expertise has had a profound influence on public health policy. It's rare to see an academic having an impact at this level in so many different ways, but this is evidence that Cathal has mastered an invaluable, if sometimes esoteric, approach to using data to inform important decisions. As one colleague put it, Cathal's ability to see the human side of statistics, to understand that behind every data set is a person, a family, a community, makes his work not just technically brilliant, but deeply meaningful. I'll let Cathal tell you more about that in his lecture, but I can say that he has published hundreds of peer-reviewed papers. He has a very healthy H-index with citations well into 5 digits. He's attracted consistent and significant support from the Health Research Board, the Irish Research Council, Science Foundation Ireland, the Wellcome Trust and others. Now, I suspect Cathal was always a high achiever, and his academic success did not come out of the blue. Even as a teen, he was fascinated by science, and Sir Roger Penrose's book, The Emperor's New Mind, concerning computers' minds and the laws of physics, caught his imagination, I think given to him by his mother, I understand, with topics like orchestrated objective reduction, microtubules, and the Platonic world. And that was just as a teenager. After the Maths Olympiad, on to Trinity for theoretical physics, changing to mathematics, and then a PhD in statistics with Simon Wilson, who unfortunately could not be here this evening with us, who he wished he could, but he said about Cathal, his great impact has been on the use of Bayesian reasoning in biostatistics, and in particular in medicine. Work on supporting decisions for accepting a drug into the public health system based on a trade-off between cost and gains in quality of life in the population is an excellent example of this. And this sort of reasoning in the pandemic was vital, given the uncertainties and lack of knowledge about what was happening, particularly in its early stages. So this natural curiosity and interest in solving real-world problems has been a thread throughout Cathal's career, as exemplified by his innovative approach to the behavioural symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. And Brian Lawler, who's with us this evening now in GBHI, put it so well: statistics can be terrifying, and most clinical research need the help of a good statistical therapist. I believe we were lucky to have found Cathal. He understood clinical issues and was patient with our questions. Maybe this came from growing up in a house where he was constantly exposed to his father's stories from the hospital. I know you're still probably telling them today. He's been a great collaborator and huge supporter of our research projects and dementia trials at St. James's Hospital and Trinity, contributing significantly to their success. But even during his time at UL, Cathal was available at the end of the phone to help guide a study or offer advice on statistical analysis. Along the way, Cathal has shaped the trajectory of biostatistics in Ireland. Under his leadership as Professor of Statistics in UL, the group expanded significantly in size and scope. He has guided numerous PhD students and early career researchers, many of whom have gone on to make significant contributions in their own right. He has served in advisory capacity for a long list of bodies here and internationally, and has an impressive network of collaborators across the world. In fact, one of Cathal's distinguishing traits is his ability to work on planes, trains and automobiles, which I find impossible, but I'm sure it counts for some of his extraordinary work output. Cathal, we are honoured to have you here today, and I have no doubt that your inaugural lecture will enrich and inspire us all. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Cathal Walsh to deliver his lecture, The Mathematics of Experience, Evidence and Choice, From Data to Decisions, a Bayesian Camino.
Good morning, Brian. Agus fáilte romh go léir. Don't recognise myself in that. You're all very welcome here tonight. I was last in Limerick. I think I brought the Limerick weather with me tonight. So thanks for coming through that. It's not so much a lecture tonight as a story of adventure that I'm going to tell. So the Camino, as many know, you get the title in your lecture, and then it clashes with when you're meant to go on the Camino. But anyway. There's others off enjoying that. They're due back tonight. The Camino is a bit like, it's a trail. It's a journey. And it has these arrows to tell you which way to go. And sometimes the arrows aren't so good, and sometimes you don't follow them. Sometimes there's one arrow pointing to the church and another one pointing to the tavern, and you have to make a choice. So that's a bit like life, right? Getting started tonight, though, in a very scouting tradition. I used to be a scout leader as well, even going as far as training trainers in Serbia during the time of Milosevic's reign. We get you to do a task at the beginning of the evening for yourselves. So there's two tasks. The first is to look around now and to pick out maybe 2 or 3 people that you don't know that you're going to say hello to later tonight. Easy for some, more difficult for others. And others are looking around thinking about 7 or 8 people they're going to pick out and talk to. There is a point to this later as well. And the next task I'd like you to do is to plan for the airport. So the task is this. You're told, you get communication to say that you have to be at the airport 2 hours in advance of your flight. And so what I'd like you to do is to come up with a number. 120, is that 2 hours before the flight? The lowest number that you're going to be at the airport, even though you're told it's 120, but the lowest number that you're going to accept to be at the airport, you think you'll get there. The expected time that you're going to aim for, could be the 2 hours, could be something different. And the earliest time, so big number, that you're going to get to the airport. So that's what I want you to do now. So think about those 3 numbers. We mightn't realize it, but what we're doing here is something called prior elicitation in the Bayesian framework. We're getting you to convert your ideas into a probability distribution. But back to the journey. The first of these pictures isn't me, it's my mum in my grandfather's arms. So my grandfather's name was Frank Rouse, and that'll be important later on. But the idea is that our journey, our experience doesn't start, of course, when we're born. It starts well before that. My grandfather, I was informed by my uncle, I didn't know this, was I think born here and was baptized in Westland Road, so very close to here. The second picture is me in the arms of my parents and in Athlone, I think, probably. And they're still here with us today. Next picture is when Peter, my brother, arrived. There's a truck there, and this was the rest of my life, really, moving around. Even now, I move between Tala and James's and main campus. Peter doesn't do the driving anymore, but he did for a few years. We lived in Dublin, and London, Liverpool, and County Durham, and then back to Ireland. John arrived then, and is working, as many know, in radiology now, and Mary at the bottom, working in research in physiotherapy. There's some numbers on the page. People may or may not know what those numbers are. We'll come back to those numbers later. So the journey to Bayes. Top left is a BBC Model B. Anyone remember those? Yeah. So Dad was big into computers even back then, and so as soon as the Model B came out, we had to have it. At one stage, Peter electrocuted himself with the computer, but he survived. His friend Johnny pushed him off with a wooden brush. He knew what to do, and so Peter survived. The book, The Emperor's New Mind, that Dean mentioned, was written by Roger Penrose, and Roger Penrose held the Rouse Ball Professorship in Oxford. And I think it was possibly at Christmas time that Mum saw this book and thought, Rouse, that must be an interesting book to get. And absolutely, and it it influenced, the small things influenced careers later on. As mentioned, I went to the Olympiad, and one of the team that went with me is professor in Maynooth now, Dave Malone. And during COVID, I was able to get on to one of the professors in evolutionary biology who now holds a chair in the States. And another one, Ollie, who couldn't make it tonight, is head of department in the maths department in Bristol. So the people that you get to know will stick with you for life, son. Realise that and be nice to people is the message for their kids. During college, and as you mentioned, doing theoretical physics, I did experiments as well. And this was my first real introduction to data. A guy called Eric Finch, who's still around, taught us in the experiments in the lab. And he taught us that data isn't truth. Oh, it was profound. He didn't say it in those words. But what he says is when you measure something, you can get a different answer every time. So that every time you extract a measurement, you might get a different number. And, we can average those numbers, but we have to accept that the errors will propagate through our system. There's the Carpenter's rule. Anyone know what the Carpenter's rule is? Measure twice, cut once. Yeah. So the importance of measurement came out from there at that time. On the right-hand side, does anyone know what this piece of equipment is? Because I can't remember. And I have nightmares to this very day. But I had a business as a child, and so my vision isn't always perfect. I build things and so on, don't have great 3D vision. But we had to count fringes, and we were measuring the speed of light. So there's a laser diffraction grating, and you measure the pattern, the fringe pattern. And then you evacuate, there's a glass cell, you evacuate the glass cell, and then you've got a vacuum. And so by the change in the fringe pattern, you get to know what the speed of light is. But this was and it looked like this, an antiquated, Victorian vacuum pump in the corner of the lab. And I just thought, this piece of equipment, it's old, you can't afford to upgrade its stuff. I can do better. So I unplugged the plastic tube and I went to get rid of the remaining air inside the tube, and we proceeded to measure the speed of light in saliva. So I gave up on experimental physics and completed a degree in mathematics. In my final year, I came across Bayesian statistics. And so I'm going to try and do a lecture in basic statistics. This bit is kind of a lecture in a few minutes, in just a couple of minutes. So we're going to do some work. Papers and pens. Everyone got papers and pens? You don't really need them. So the whole idea behind Bayesian statistics is we can convert numbers, our beliefs or our understanding or opinions into probability distributions. And if you've done that experiment at the start of tonight, so you pick 3 numbers, then you can create a diagram like we have at the very top here. So this is the central number in the middle, and a left and a right. You can then place a probability distribution on that, and this is this green, which people may be familiar with. In this case, we do a normal distribution, and that becomes your prior belief about when you're going to get to the airport. So it goes, in this case, you might have said that, I'm definitely going to get there 2 hours in advance. I'm going to aim for 3 hours, and maybe I could get there 4 hours in advance. So this is almost like you, Dad, except you're more to the right here, I think. I sat in the airport 6 hours before a flight in New Zealand with Dad. And I don't know about others, but I suspect some people are to the left of this as well. Not looking at anyone in particular. But anyway, you can create this distribution, this probability distribution. And then you go and you collect some data. So you look at some observations. And here we've got the person has arrived at the airport twice. And we've updated, using what's called the likelihood, which is represented by this black bar here, our understanding of when that person, the average time at which that person gets to the airport. They believed that they were going to be there about 3 hours in advance, but practice said otherwise. And so now their belief is shifted to the left of what they'd originally believed. And that is all there is to know about Bayesian statistics. You don't need any of the other stuff, actually. You don't need any of the other stuff. This is all there is to know about Bayesian statistics. And that's our belief, conditional on what I believed before, what I'd said in advance, and what I observed now. If I have more observations, I can just crank through this process and update my beliefs. So it's easy. So are we done already? Well, there is a little more to it, I guess. You know, the choice of statistical model is important. And the phrase evidence comes from data, but isn't data. We sometimes think that data and evidence are the same thing. They're not. Data is the observation, the top left there, so this is capital X. We have a statistical model which might account for the way in which the measurements were taken. That's this lens, if you like. It reverses the measurement process that we did in labs. And then it estimates something about this unknown theta, which we've always called the estimand, but in clinical trial literature it's become popular to talk about estimands now. They've always been there, but currently we do discuss them. It's that thing that we want to estimate. It's the average time you're going to get to the airport. You'll never know it because, you know, you might keep coming forward and back to the airport, but it's a thing that we need to estimate. Any Joyce fans here? So there's a discussion on the right-hand side there. So I think the whatness is that the horseness is the whatness of all horse, is the phrase, the Joycean phrase. And there's this abstract thing that we want to know about, the horseness. The lens helps us to describe it, and the things that we observe are horses. So simple as that. But data aren't truth. And we'll never know truth. So that's a Bayesian idea. We'll never know that what the true value of that estimate is. We just have beliefs about it. But we can inform ourselves quite well about it. And that is the nature of Bayesian inference. Something else plops out of this framework as well. So here are the green curves, because we prepared this earlier, and of course I've asked you all for your numbers and so on, Blue Peter style. And on the left panel there are 8 different prior distributions from 8 different people that I've asked for their numbers. So you differ, you have different distributions. And I can use that in my inference. I've plotted them on the same graph here on the right-hand side. But I noticed something. There are the people who, and in black I've coloured the people who commute a lot, and in red the people who do it less frequently. And there is one of the red people, you know, who has a pattern of coming to the airport like the majority of the people who commute all the time. And then there's others on the right-hand side who like to come early. Now this is just a toy example, of course. It's when do you come to the airport? But this could be about other stuff. It could be about parameters in a model. It could be about the rate of infection, transmission of disease. And there's a risk when we do prior elicitation that we get it wrong. And on the left-hand side, you have a bunch of people perhaps who trained in the same medical school or in the same discipline or in the same subspeciality or are of the same gender or ethnic origin. And so they believe the same things and they haven't had exposure to other situations. This is a mathematical argument why we need diversity in order to inform science and avoid early groupthink. There's another bit to the Bayesian framework, and that's about what do we value. And we use this when we're deciding on drugs. You know, we're trading off side effects versus efficacy, for example. You might have dose of radiation versus the benefit of getting a particular test and so on. So these are relative benefits. And the question becomes, in broad terms, which do you prefer? So who prefers jellies? Who prefers chocolate? Who prefers jellies? Hands up. Chocolate? Ooh, I don't know, is it Dublin? In Limerick, you know, people like jellies more maybe. It's like, we did it with sweet and savoury pancakes. Who's a sweet pancake person? Savoury pancakes. See, I'm savoury. I'm definitely savoury. Yeah. Other questions. We'll go through them quickly because there's one at the end that my dad thinks isn't a real question. So, red wine or Coke? Red wine? Coke? Sorry, red wine wins. Cats or dogs? Cats? Dogs. Alan Kelly, I think, used to love cats. So, and the last one, of course, is PC or Mac. But the point about this is our values are necessarily subjective. We're allowed to disagree about values. We shouldn't be disagreeing if we have enough information, enough evidence about that hoarseness, if you like. We shouldn't be ultimately disagreeing about that. We shouldn't be disagreeing about matters of fact. But we do disagree about what we think is important. And actually, do you know, that's okay. That's allowed. So with the values and utilities, and you're deciding to take drive, taxi, or air coach to go to the airport, which do you choose? And here's a scenario. Let's say we've whittled it down, taxi or air coach. So if you take a taxi and you get the flight, well, that's good. If you take an expensive taxi and you don't get the flight, you'd be mightily disappointed. And so I've marked that as red. This is a scenario you don't want to be in. Yeah? You don't want to pay for a taxi and then miss the flight because it costs you money and so on. The best scenario is that you got a cheap bus and you also could spend money on chocolate, right? So that's the best world to live in. And even if you miss the flight and you get chocolate, it might be okay. So you can see that there's a ranking of these outcomes. But the analogy, so we're not really talking about chocolate, of course. We're not talking about taxis and buses. We're talking about how we delivered healthcare. And if everyone gets a taxi, then a lot of people are going to lose out. I remember a discussion, and it was at the, in Houston, in the MD Anderson. There was the Bayesian Biostats conference there. And it was one of the Harvard statisticians that was there. And she looked at my poster and she said, "This stuff is disgraceful. The way you guys ration healthcare." And I said, "Well, Sharon, you guys ration healthcare as well." She said, "No, we don't. If you can afford it, you can get it." I said, "Exactly." And so this is what we spend a lot of our time doing in the NCPE, is informing these decisions. But before I got there, I did a PhD with Simon, using engineering data on short crack propagation in steel. So this is my PhD. On the left-hand side is a zoomed-in picture of a piece of metal. In the middle is the data, so that's an average across lots of sets of data, the rate of growth of the of cracks with the length of crack and rate of growth together. So when the cracks are short, they accelerate in terms of the speed of growth, they hit a boundary and slow down, and then speed up and slow down and so on. Essentially, in the PhD, all I had to do was estimate parameters from, quite a complex model, so we won't go into too much detail of that, but at the bottom here, we're different. If you change the parameters, this is the different shape of curve you can get. So essentially, we're fitting the curves to the data that we have. It was challenging. So I said Bayesian statistics is easy, but actually this process is tricky. But the side discussions during our PhD are sometimes more fun. One of the psychologists here, a guy called Ray Fuller, was talking to me about the human factors in terms of aircraft maintenance. And one of the challenges they had was they had to inspect for cracks. And think about a prior distribution. You don't think there's going to be many cracks. And if the inspectors keep inspecting the aircraft and they don't find any cracks, what happens? They don't expect cracks. So even when there's a crack there, they don't see it. So what was the solution? It was brilliant. What do you do? They created fake cracks. They created little cracks on sellotape, and they used to sellotape it to the aircraft. Has that got an application in medicine? Possibly. Certainly in medical training. Yeah. Well, when I finished my PhD, I worked in a company called Mercer, but I'd also been hoodwinked by the then dean of medicine and health science at the time, so Davis Coakley, who introduced me to another Mercer, the Mercer's Institute. And the Mercer's Institute I worked in just before I had started working with people there just before I finished my PhD. I was a statistician, but I was also the guinea pig. I went in one day and I ended up with these little rods in my head where they were doing an evoked potential on a screen. So I had this glue in my hair for weeks afterwards. And then he told me afterwards they hadn't connected the earth lead, so the experiment was useless anyway. So this is also the nature of science. Many people here will know that too, right? There's so many things we've got wrong over the years. It's all part of the journey. But the stuff we were doing there, I thought, was more exciting in some ways than the stuff we were doing at Mercer. First time I met Shane Whelan, who's here tonight, was when I was at Mercer. He's a fund manager in Friends First. I remember sitting distinctly, I don't know if Shane remembers this, distinctly sitting outside on NASA Street. I think we come out of a lecture in that evening. He said, he's giving me a lift home. And he mentioned that a job had come up in UCD. I said, yeah, a job came up in Trinity as well. You going to go for your one? Yeah. You going to go for yours? Yeah, I think so. So I think Shane went to UCD about the same time as I went to Trinity. I had a short stop actually with a campus company in Trinity called Insight. And I went through that and we did all sorts of fabulous, interesting things within Insight. Credit card fraud, telephone fraud detection, modelling, random numbers in lotteries, different part of statistics, not biostatistics, but something completely different. When I was employed in Trinity, they said that my job, because there was two jobs, and Brendan was here, I think Brendan probably got the first, there was one job, and I think Brendan kind of got that, but they ended up employing two of us. So Brendan, who's now in UCD, Brendan Murphy, got the job at the same time. And afterwards I discovered, and it's only afterwards you realise what goes on behind the scenes, but that they must have realised that there was a job somewhere between statistics and management science, they said. And this was the job that they were essentially creating on the basis of the EMSIS program for me. Because one of the questions in the interview, though, was about what do you think is on the boundary of statistics and management science? And I kind of said, haven't a clue. And I remember it was Donald Lyons asked the question. And I said, what do you think is on the boundary between management science and statistics? And he said, data mining. And data mining is kind of data science. They took these big data sets and they looked for patterns in the data sets. And with big data sets, like data sets on the travel cards you use on the bus, and they're anonymous, but you could still identify individuals even though they were anonymous. So it was a monthly card that you did on the bus. So no one knew what the ID number was on the monthly card. But the person would get on the bus and get off somewhere else. But because the pattern was they got on the same stop at about the same time every day, you could figure out the next month what the ID code was to link January's card with February's card, with March's card. And if something changed in their life, you figured that out too. Because during the month, their journeys might change. So these are concerns that we have about data, of course, still today. And this was more than 20 years ago now. So through the time in college, I worked between theory and application. And the top right is an example of an applied paper, and in the bottom left, we kind of do some of the theory behind it. But in the bottom right was a paper, and it was with a student in the diploma. And he came up after the Bayesian lecture and said, could we do a Bayesian study? And what we have here is a cumulative meta-analysis. Going from left to right, you include more information. And top to bottom is our belief, so it's the width of the confidence interval, about how effective this intervention is over time. And there were two ways of looking at this. You could just say, I'll treat all the evidence at face value. Or in the second approach, what you do is you downweight observational studies compared to randomized controlled trials. And the divergence between them is if you downweight some evidence because you believe for some reason there should be greater uncertainty attached to it because of the veracity, perhaps, of the data. So we can use that lens, and we can say to the lens, we don't quite believe that data is worth the same as the data over there. But through work with Killian, I ended up working with Michael Hutchinson and Vincent and Peter Kelly in the Matter, with whom I've worked a lot since, both of them since. So I did a sabbatical escape some years afterwards. Beautiful city, Brisbane in Australia. Fantastic Bayesian group. And it was Niall Friel recommended it as a destination. Mixture of applications. So there was the reason I went there, and Elisa, who was a PhD student at the time when we went to the meeting, will remember as well discussions about what they were doing. They were trying to estimate how many kangaroos would be in different parts of the outback on the basis of different covariates. And so you'd have this prior predictive distribution. You'd say something like, I expect there to be 10 kangaroos in the spot. You go over and look. If you found 2, then your prior's wrong, but you could use it to update your information. I thought, that's what I want to do. Go out and count crocodiles and kangaroos. I mentioned a bump in the road, and that happens on Camino, it happens in life, and a lot of people in computer science and some other people know as well there was a bump in the road, and sometimes bumps in the road are actually made of flesh and blood. And it had a big impact on me, and I know on the family, but you get up and you move on. And I decided, and it was chat with people in Australia as well, 2 things I created. One was the idea of Wandering Wednesday. And I thought to myself, right, on Wednesdays, I'm going to try and do something different. Might get on a bus, might get on a train, go down the country. Might get on a plane and visit the Royal Statistical Society meetings. So it's the initiative to go off and do something else. The other one was the get up, get out. I quite enjoyed, even though for some people it might be painful, the needle's been stuck in my head and finding out what was happening on that screen. I'd make sure that they plugged the earth lead in. So I ended up, as a consequence, working with people who I perhaps wouldn't have worked with otherwise. So good things can come out of bumps in the road, though you mightn't realize it until much, much later on. In 2007, we just buried a grandaunt, and I had 3 young children, and I was trying not to drop them into the sea off Cove. Dad was helping, but sometimes that makes one even more concerned not to drop your children into the sea off Cove. And the phone rang, and it was Michael Barry from pharmacology. And, Michael had just buried his mum as well, but I think he had a deadline. He had given him a deadline to do some reports, and he needed a statistician, but he kind of plummosed you into doing stuff anyway. So that's how I got involved with the NCP, was because they'd work to do, and they needed a statistician. And I see Cara here tonight. Do you remember the HPV, HTA? It's good that this is in small scale because there's a little wobble between scenarios 2, 3, and 4. And I know why that is now. At the time, it took a while. But this is how it ended up in the report, in the HEQA report. And it wasn't until some years later I fully appreciated why it's there. But that you'd expect that to be a nice smooth curve. The scenarios were vaccinate up to age 12, catch up to age 14, 15, 17, 19, and so on. On the right-hand side is another example. It's the HTA of colorectal cancer screening. And I think the first time working with Trish possibly was the rotavirus vaccine for NIAC assessment that we did. So the years later, and it was a guy from Canada, and we were looking at the heterogeneity between agent-based transmission dynamic simulations. And we discovered that there's lots. So actually the advantage of your agent-based simulation, which is where you create lots of little turtles and get them to interact with each other, and some of them get diseased and some of them get sick and some of them die. And then you have an intervention, so you vaccinate some people and see if fewer turtles die. The advantage is that it's realistic, you can model herd immunity. The downside is it's computationally intensive, and this was some time ago, this computing, and we were using limited enough resources. And so the residual uncertainty, the reason for the kink in the line, is just stochastic variability. It's just sampling variability of our simulations. That's why that was there. But we realized that all the other models have it as well. So actually, the comparison between scenarios 2 and 3 and 4 weren't as valid as the comparison between doing nothing and scenario 1. But that was 6 or 7 years later, that paper with Mark in Canada. There was another case of the colorectal cancer calibration. And the way they'd done it, we were working with a team from Sheffield, Sophie and Jim. And the way they did it there was they picked a set of parameters that they were going to use for their model. And they ran it through the model to see how well the parameter set fitted to the observed data. And they'd use the top 1,000. And I could see of those top 1,000 how well they fitted. And actually, the weight according to how well they fitted was the first parameter set should have 90% of the weight. The second had 8%, and the rest were useless parameter sets. And I said this to Sophie, and Sophie was a mathematician, like pure mathematician, so There was no, just kind of more or less explain to me what's happening and let's figure this one out, So we went through it and I said, yeah, there's this algorithm I used during my PhD, it's MCMC. And she said, I remember sitting and it was in the Lloyd building, writing on the board, going through it. She said, why don't we do it? I said, okay. The model was built in Excel. I'd written all my code in C from scratch, and this model was built in Excel. And so we wrote the algorithm into Excel and we ran MCMC in Excel. But it was slow, but it was there, proof and principle. So that's what mathematicians do. I'm looking at David here as well. Mathematicians go, yeah, in principle this should work. And then in terms of the practicalities, then you kind of say, well, how am I going to make it work? Do you know how we made it work? We printed out a sheet of paper saying out of order. We put it on the undergraduate computer lab. And we ran it on all the machines. Now, it was okay. It was the Easter break. But we ran it in parallel, and we ran it for a week on the machines in the undergraduate computer lab. And we calibrated the model. And we were able to meet the requirements of the HEQA HDA. And we wrote a paper about it as well. Here's another one, and this was a conversation with Shane and Alan on one of the Wandering Wednesdays when I cycled over to Tala. And this was a real event that happened some years ago. So this is cancer screening, and it was a two-phase screening. So the first phase was, I think, a radiological exam, and the question was, how suspicious are these cases? Will I refer them on for surgical kind of biopsy? And so that's the first stage. The first stage is the radiological exam. Really suspicious ones you can see, oh yeah, is my understanding. John will know more than me, and as you go down, you can go, and as you get to the bottom, you say, oh, not suspicious at all. And so you have to draw a line and say, how many are going to refer on? And in fact, so in this case, if we look at this example, the reds are marked as actual cases and greens as ones that don't have disease. And if you draw the line where you draw the line, you're sending on, 18 cases for surgical review. And the false positive rate here, that's the people who are okay, is 50%. So the surgeon has had to deal with 18 biopsies, and half of them were okay. So the surgeon gets mad and goes back to the radiologist and says, look, you keep sending me these, and they're all false positives. Why do you do that? Can you not improve your metric? So will we try and make the false positive rate lower? We'll try and get a lower false positive rate? Do you think we can do that? Human factors again. So person under pressure told, only send me ones that you think are higher risk. Can you look ahead, see what's going to happen? This is what happened. They only refer the more suspicious cases. So they only refer 6 cases. And the surgeon says, great, lower workload. And also the false positive rate goes down to 33%. It's a success, isn't it? Or can we see what's happened? We can see that there's lower sensitivity and we've missed 5 cases. What happens next? There's outcry in the media. How could the system be failing? How can screening not be delivering? Well, the reality is we're always going to miss cases with screening. And we're always going to have to make that trade-off between sensitivity and specificity. But it's something that was, I think, poorly understood in both the media and actually, possibly, within the clinical population. The person who's seeing these cases thinks, yes, I'm seeing fewer of them, and more of them are now true positives. That must be a good thing. So the intuition is going the wrong way. Work with Susie and Roisin. Happy birthday. They both have a birthday today, same day. Happy birthday. Dominic, what's the chance that happens? 100%. It's a subtle one, but actually, if something is already true, it has a 100% probability of happening. That's the personal nature. It's the personal nature of probability, actually. So as a Bayesian, if you know something to be true, the probability of it happening is 100% because you know it's true. So it's well trained. So this was looking at, can we incorporate real-world evidence or data of other types into our designs? Key work, very much used nowadays. You use clinical trials, but you could use observational studies, and we had kind of a matched essentially single-armed evidence in there. And we extended, I should say that they didn't share birthdays for all their years. How could that be? Well, it could. It's not just because they're different ages, because that's true as well, but that's one to think about for later. It's another one of Shane's points as well, and I saw it on the Revenue Commissioner's site recently. What did the Revenue Commissioners do between 1920 and 1930? Therese, do you know? There were a whole lot of people drawing pensions, and this goes to the blue zones. I don't know if you followed the discussion on the blue zones recently, but there's in Ireland, we had people living for much longer, and this is one of the books that Shane published recently, show that people in Ireland lived longer some years ago, to a great age. And the reason was that you got a pension when you were age 70, and there was no birth cert. So if I got a pension now, age 70, I'm going to live to a big age. And the discussion about the blue zones is that in areas where there's poor documentation, people live a very long life. So that goes to the accuracy of data. But we continued on, and there's a number of publications that come out of this, and we looked at whether or not you can deal with single-armed evidence. And the short answer is that too long didn't read, is we can do this. We can account for the fact that you've got something that isn't an RCT. We can build it into our modelling, and we can do something useful with it. However, while in principle it might be possible to work around bad design, it's not a good idea, not least because it encourages continued bad design. That yoke on the top left, have you ever seen one of those? I'd never seen one of these. I saw someone with it recently. You know what it is? What does it look like? It looks like a seatbelt, doesn't it? You know when you're driving and you haven't quite put your seatbelt on yet, not that that would ever happen. But do you know what happens? What happens? It goes beep, 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 beep. Yeah? So if you have one of these things, you can clip it into... So this is a method of overcoming something that should be there. And the same is happening with our landscape of clinical trials at the moment. The push for real-world evidence is killing clinical trials. We need better data. We need better data. And I'll say more about it later. In exile, on loan, like a footballer, we did some great stuff in Limerick. Some of it's been mentioned already. But I mentioned the Fitbit so the Fitbit charge, and it's the Actigraph, I think, is that called? Actipal, yeah. So we did a study to see if they agreed. Short answer, they don't. And we then compared it to counting the steps. Neither of them agree with that either. So this is another example of, I don't want to say bad data, but just the measurement process giving you a number, which you may be able to use, but it's not truth. The other example was an interesting problem where we had to figure out how to get cars around the country most efficiently. How do you pack those car transporters? Real applied problem. I mean, this is kind of the fun stuff we do in applied mathematics. But other adventures along the way, worked with the Royal Statistical Society, Cochrane, very useful during COVID, connections around the world. Bottom right there, AIMS, so I taught in Tanzania, bottom right there, trying to establish a modelling and biostats unit, right? So we did, towards the end of the pandemic, we were right on the cusp of establishing this modelling and biostats unit. A good home for it is within the HBSC, and as people know, recruitment has been a barrier there, but it's certainly a gap. The COVID years, I'll talk about briefly, because we're all kind of sick of talking and listening of the COVID years. But to point out that actually I think we were broadly prepared pre-2020, enough so that when we panicked we could get there. The way Ireland works is that the CMO at the time texted his sister-in-law, who happened to be Dean of Research in university, who got in touch with a statistician who happened to know me, and we gathered a group of people together. But a lot of work had been funded already. For example, the NCP and HBSC had already worked on disease modelling previously, so we'd already got those connections. The Insight Analytics Centre was funded. The Maths Application Centre in Limerick, Applied Maths in Limerick, was very strong. The vet centre was doing research at the time already. So a lot of and Galway had Pandem, they were housing a European project on pandemic preparedness. So we had stuff in place and we joined it up. And thanks in part to Philip's work, I think it was one of the best groups that I've ever worked with, national training team aside, of course. But it was one of those situations where we just got on with it, where we worked, we knew we had work to do, and maybe because statisticians are quite quiet. They're annoying, but they're quite quiet. I mean, mathematicians as well, and applied mathematics are even quieter, perhaps. We just got on and did the work. On the right-hand side are some of the graphs that I did, before even the modelling. Simple simulation graphs showing if you have high levels of transmission, you get this peak at the bottom. Low levels of transmission are flatter and more uncertain. People were shocked in the media that this large number of cases could happen. Quick simulation, you go, well, yeah, it could happen. It could happen. We'd many unknowns then, we still do now. So we don't observe things like generation time. We don't observe the transmission rate per se directly. So these are unknown. These are the hoarseness of disease modelling, really. Things that we don't know. What is that infectious threshold? When will people be transmitting the virus? And we're estimating and guessing as we go. The diagram on the right-hand side are notes from a book that I kept at the time. So these are the kind of pictures that we draw to inform us as we go. One of the mistakes that they made in the UK, and I listened carefully to John Edmonds on the television, Channel 4 one day, and he mentioned a doubling time. How long does it take for a number of cases to double? That was longer than we were getting. So I knew that the estimate that they were having, and like we had at the start of the set of slides, if you've a narrow support for that distribution, if you're pretty certain about something, it'll take a lot to convince you that it could go otherwise. So the lesson from that is forget what you know, or try and forget some of what you know at least, because it could be different this time. More pictures again. On the left-hand side is data. We have some observed cases. We try and model this continuous beta function, and we approximate it with a kind of a square function, and we look at the possible impact of interventions. Notice that there's not a lot of data here, right? So these are sketches. These are like ideas. And that's a lot of what mathematicians and statisticians do. We spend a lot of our time thinking about, well, schematically, what's going on here? What's happening? And then we go and we calculate. And we did. We said, what if, Here's the data stream. And I vividly remember at this time in the pandemic, the numbers had been going up and then they slowed down a bit. And I think I said, I don't believe it. I don't believe that those numbers have stalled. We haven't done enough interventions for those numbers to have stalled. Is there anything else going on? Could we be missing some tests? There's a few on the flight to Germany that will come back. So we knew that there were some that were missing. So we knew that we were missing. It looked like they were missing. Gut instinct, as a statistician says, we're missing some values. And when we went to look for them, we knew they were there. They weren't tested yet, but you could still say, well, we expect 5% of them to come back positive. So we can make up data that isn't there. And actually, that's much better than trusting data that are wrong in our modelling. This is the last of these slides, I think, really, the force of infection. People couldn't understand why we opened up when there were 200 cases. We shut when there was 150. Why are we opening up when there's 200? The answer is because the true process that we're concerned about is how much infection is out there. There's a lag between infections and when they present. The red line is the true force of infection. It's the cases circulating. And the black ones that are presenting. If you're on the right-hand side of this graph, the cases are presenting and they're falling very quickly. You can infer that the force of infection is quite low. So even though your case numbers are high on the way down, you can safely reopen. And the models we used, we knew, as many people know, 3 models. James Gleeson fitting an SEI or model, Jim Duggan in Galway fitting the age cohort model, and Liz was fitting an agent-based simulation, similar to the ones that we'd used previously for our HPV. some reflections, but the key bit is in red. A modelling unit in a HPSC is a must. The work on that starts again tomorrow, I think. Data revisited. So clinical trials are excellent, and there's been a couple of clinical trials. The one that Brian's been involved in was mentioned already, the Vadapine one, and there was a recent one that we published in The Lancet with Peter Kelly on colchicine in secondary prevention for stroke. This is quality. This is quality data. This is what we need to use for our evidence and for making our decisions, and we don't do enough of it. I've never seen. It was almost like a statistical joke. A p-value 0.0495 occurred in this Lancet paper, but we'd looked at the data already. So actually, the threshold wasn't 0.05 that we used. We should have been using a threshold of 0.048. So that 0.0495 was not statistically significant. But it's quality data, and that's what matters. Other important sources of data, they seem expensive, but they're very cheap, really. Very good value. Is that right? Very cheap for what you get. And that's the big studies like TILDA, where we need quality data collection. We know how the measurements have been taken, and we're doing it longitudinally over time. So we know a lot about the individuals involved in the study. Growing Up in Ireland is another example. The PRECISE studies in health care workers was another one I've been involved in. And another initiative, Mark, your one, Dandelion. So that's an initiative where, and it's Mark Little here, wants to get it going, to connect digital sources across this part of the country, the city. So we need less data, better quality data, and data that we've collected for the right reasons. It's paraphrasing someone there. The journey continues. So here's the gang, already on their own journey, and Peter's no longer in the seat with me, so I have a new driver, Roisin, taking the picture there. The numbers, what do those numbers mean? Well, those numbers are the concentration of CO2 when each of the individuals were born. And if we plot them on a graph, anyone that was involved during the pandemic, this kind of a curve looks scarily familiar. There's exponential growth. We're in trouble. We need to consider carefully what we're doing with our world. With Matthew, we've been funded recently, Matthew Chersick is here, I think, funded recently from the Wellcome Trust to looking at the attribution of the impact of climate change in heat going forward, and methods for that. You never get there. It's all about the journey, guys. And thank you all for being part of mine. Let's get on with the adventure.